When we talk about the collapse of Lehman Brothers back in 2008, the story is usually about all these complex financial things, market failure and subprime mortgages. But what if the real story is way simpler? What if it's a human story, a battle for the very soul of a company? A tale of ambition, loyalty, and, in the end, a devastating betrayal.
See, at the heart of Lehman Brothers, there was this ideal, this culture they called one firm. It was this belief in succeeding together, in teamwork over absolutely everything else. And the guy who was the living, breathing embodiment of that ideal, that was the firm's president, Chris Pettit.
So this idea of one firm, it wasn't just some slogan they put on the wall. At its core was Chris Pettit, a man that a lot of people really thought of as the soul of Lehman. To understand this ethos, you really just have to look at Pettit's background. This guy was the real deal. A decorated war hero from Vietnam, a top athlete, just a man of deep principle. He was the kind of person others just naturally wanted to follow. And even after he made a fortune, he apparently had this thing against wealth, choosing to live a really simple life. He was, in a lot of ways, the true north, the moral compass of Lehman Brothers.
But, every story needs a foil. And in this one, his name was Richard S. Fuld Jr. He was this gritty, incredibly ambitious trader who would claw his way up to become CEO. And on the street, he had a nickname, the Gorilla. Fuld represented a very different kind of ambition.
Now, Fuld wasn't always this polished leader he eventually became. He started out as a pretty insecure trader, actually. He famously took Dale Carnegie courses to completely remake himself. He learned how to be this confident speaker. But deep down, at his core, he was always that fierce, scrappy trader who would never ever back down from a fight.
And this warrior image, it was a core part of his whole identity. One of his staff once gave him this nickname he'd heard in a nature documentary, Toi du Malin. It means he who greets with fire. It was about a lion that fought off like 40 hyenas. And Fuld, he absolutely loved it.
So you've got these two very different leaders at the top of the same company. A collision was basically inevitable, right? And this power struggle between Fuld, the warrior, and Pettit, the team builder, it would become the definitive turning point for Lehman, the moment that set it on a direct path to ruin.
And then the showdown came. Fuld gave Pettit an ultimatum: fire 2 loyal executives. But Pettit, being true to his whole team mantra, refused. Fuld's response was swift and it was brutal. He stripped Pettit of all his power and basically banished him to this tiny little office on what they called the dead zone floor, a place for has-beens. Just like that, the one-firm culture was officially dead. The personal toll of this betrayal was just devastating. Pettit's own daughter, Laura, found him in that tiny office, and for the first time in her entire life, she saw her father weep. The man who had built Lehman's entire culture on loyalty was just broken by this profound act of disloyalty. And the end of Pettit's story is it's so tragic and abrupt. Humiliated, he left the firm he had poured his life into building, and then, just a few weeks later, he was killed in a snowmobile accident. With his death, the last piece of the old Lehman, the one built on teamwork and principle, it was gone, for good.
So, with Pettit gone, there's this massive power vacuum. And into that void steps a whole new kind of leader, Joe Gregory. As Fuld's new right-hand man, his rise would signal a complete and total transformation of the company's values.
And the contrast between Pettit and Gregory, it could not be more stark. It's like night and day. Where Pettit was all about the team, Gregory was a master of internal politics. And apparently, he was driven by this deep insecurity. And while Pettit lived simply, Gregory had a personal spending budget of $15 million a year. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a complete revolution in the company's culture.
And what's wild is that the new regime even started to rewrite history to justify its own power. In his private journals, Gregory actually painted Pettit, the guy who was the firm's soul, as the villain in the story. It was this perfect narrative to protect Fuld and, of course, cement his own position right there at the top.
All right, so this cultural rot, this shift in values, it didn't just stay in the executive suites. It began to seep right into the firm's finances. The values of loyalty and teamwork were swapped out for a culture of secrecy, personal greed, and just a reckless disregard for any kind of real risk.
A perfect example of this was a practice they called Dick's Reserve. So think of it like this. On days when traders made a ton of money, they'd hide some of those profits in this secret little kitty. Then, on the losing days, they'd dip into it to make the losses look smaller. It was this daily fiction designed to hide volatility from everyone. It basically embedded deception right into the firm's DNA and blinded leadership to the massive dangers sitting on their book.
At the same time, the firm demanded this absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Spouses were just expected to raise their children alone. One executive's wife, Corinne Jack, was in labor by herself because her husband couldn't possibly miss a meeting. Another executive who asked for some time off to care for his child with cystic fibrosis was demoted immediately. This kind of relentless pressure created an environment where absolutely no one dared to question authority or deliver bad news, which, as you can imagine, is a fatal flaw when your firm is taking on bigger and bigger risks.
Back in 1998, the CFO, a guy named John Cecil, was actually punished for taking 2 weeks to diligently check the company's financials during a crisis. His bosses wanted speed, not caution. Years later, he reflected on that, saying that if that same caution had been applied 10 years later, well, Lehman might have actually survived.
But caution was a total thing of the past, and the cracks in the foundation became impossible to ignore when a hedge fund manager named David Einhorn started digging into Lehman's books. He found a staggering $1.1 billion discrepancy in their accounting, and he publicly challenged their numbers, exposing the rot at the firm's very core.
By September of 2008, the game was up. The whole house of cards, built on this foundation of hubris and a corrupted culture, it was about to come crashing down. The final days played out like something from a Greek tragedy. Fuld was in complete denial, attacking anyone who dared to question him. As the firm was just bleeding cash, he desperately searched for a buyer. But his own arrogance kept sabotaging the deals. Right up to the end, he was defiant, convinced he was too big to fail, that the government would have no choice but to step in and save him. He was wrong.
In the end, Fuld was totally isolated. While he was sitting upstairs writing a memo about how horrible he felt, his own employees were so angry that security had to prevent him from even visiting the trading floor for his own safety. Someone had literally taken a picture of his face off the wall and was defacing it. The gorilla was finally caged.
And in this surreal final note, one that just brings this whole story full circle, one of Chris Pettit's old friends actually visited a medium. When he asked the supposed spirit of Chris Pettit about Joe Gregory, the man who replaced him, the response was just a single word: deceived. And the aftermath, it just shows this stunning lack of accountability. Joe Gregory sued the bankrupt estate for over $233 million in future salary. Dick Fuld eventually offered a quiet apology to one of his colleagues, and the firm they led was responsible for the single largest bankruptcy in American history.
Which leaves us with a final really big question. We always talk about derivatives and subprime mortgages and systemic risk, but when you look at the story of Pettit and Fuld and Gregory, you just have to wonder, was the financial crisis really a failure of complex markets, or was it something much, much simpler, a failure of character?